Hi everyone, how are you? I would like to welcome everyone to our new podcast, Eurodosis, from the Center of European Studies and the Monnet Center of Excelencia. In this first episode, we have a very special guest, Lucian Cernat. Lucian Cernat is a renowned economist with more than 2 decades of experience in international trade policy. He currently serves as the head of global regulatory cooperation and international procurement negotiations at the European Commission. Cernat has a strong academic background. He holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Manchester and a postgraduate diploma from the University of Oxford. We know that trade and employment are rapidly changing due to new technologies. From your perspective, how do you think this advancement could impact the quality of employment in Europe? Should we be more optimistic or concerned?
Well, I think this is an excellent question to start our podcast, since nowadays these type of issues are on everyone's top agenda. And just to give you an example, you are probably familiar with the latest Nobel Prize winners and their work, Daron Acemoglu and Stephen Johnson. They have looked at many aspects that touch upon this question. For instance, they've written in 2023 a book called Power and Prosperity, where they tackle exactly these questions. What will be the impact of new technologies, robotics, or artificial intelligence in our societies in the future? And they indicate a number of potentially worrisome trends. They've documented instances where new technologies can have a negative impact on society or on the labor force. Some technologies are explicitly designed to replace labor rather than enhance productivity for workers. But despite these worrisome trends, the book remains optimistic in its conclusions, because it says that it's up to us humans to make the best use of such new and powerful technologies. So when it comes to trade and employment in Europe, I think it's a crucial moment for us to tackle these issues and to make the right choices. We have to make the right choices as policymakers, but also as entrepreneurs, as society at large. If we make the right choices for technology, it could be a force for good. Otherwise, it may have significant negative connotations, at least according to the latest winners of the Nobel Prize. So I think this is the right type of questions to engage in our conversation.
A few weeks ago, the Draghi report was published, and it mentions that there is an innovation gap between the United States and Europe. Additionally, we see that so-called unicorn companies, for those who don't know, these are startups whose market valuations exceed $1 billion. These companies are being constrained by regulations that affect their growth, leading them to move to the United States to continue expanding. So, how can we, the European Union, compete with the United States, innovate more, and ensure that these types of companies stay in Europe?
Yes, I think the Draghi report is, at least in Brussels, but I'm sure everywhere else in policy circles or in academia, is one of the most read reports nowadays. It tackles many issues, including the one you just mentioned, the innovation gap between the EU and other countries like the United States. And it is true, if you use certain metrics, you will detect such innovation gap. Maybe not in all sectors, but in many important sectors. There are some initial diagnoses in the Draghi report. It's all about R&D investment. It's about making sure that great ideas from the young generation, like you and your fellow students, translate into the entrepreneurial world. For instance, the EU is very good at generating fundamental research. We're still very capable of being at the frontier of knowledge. What is missing, according to many analyses, including the Draghi report, is translating such innovation and research output into tangible economic activities. So there is a role there for many stakeholders and players. Of course, policy making may have a role to play, but I think there's also a cultural difference between the United States and the EU. In the United States, I think it's okay to try and fail. In Europe, probably the cultural pressure, but also the legislation. If you try to set up a company and if you do not succeed the first time, I think that's not as easy to bounce back and try again as in other countries like the United States or even India for that matter. So I think there is no easy solution to what is an important diagnosis. Yes, we need to translate innovation into economic progress for our prosperity. But if I bring the conversation closer to what I do, trade policy and the way in which Europe competes globally, I think this stark contrast between the EU and the US is not so clear. The European Union and European exporters are very competitive. So there is a bit of a paradox. We do not innovate overall in terms of the overall economy, probably or not on par with the United States, also productivity-wise. But when it comes to those firms in Europe, those superstar firms in Europe that can export, we see superior performance from European exporters compared to the US counterparts. So I think there is probably part of the solution also if future research will try to unpack this mini paradox. How can Europe lag behind in innovation and yet be stronger than the United States in global trade?
Recently, there has been a lot of talk about strategic autonomy, and we see that it's one of the European Union's main challenges. Why is strategic autonomy so important?
Well, strategic autonomy, it's a concept that was developed in a non-economic sphere. It was initially, I think, a defense concept. So you can easily understand why in that policy domain, having the ability to react to unforeseen circumstances without necessarily depending on too many actors who may or may not be ready for you is an ideal scenario. Now, translating strategic autonomy to economics is not so clear-cut, but I think the way it is being used nowadays is to ensure that we are not over-dependent and vulnerable in critical areas for our economic prosperity. So just to give you an example, we've seen, for instance, during the COVID pandemic that although by and large global supply chains function surprisingly well despite those constraints, there were pockets of economic activities where the whole continent was dependent on a handful of firms. And when you have problems in supply chain and when those firms who are the only way for you to procure essential ingredients are abroad, that creates a very difficult situation. So strategic autonomy is a concept that will, in my view, would apply to a handful of crucially important areas, and it will require us being more agile, having a more diversified supply source and ability to hedge our risks against unforeseen circumstances. It's still early days of the concept. Let's wait and see how it evolves.
You just have mentioned that the problem in the COVID pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, the problem with the shortage of cheap supplies. This led to the shutdown of many industries in Europe. Moreover, in this so-called fourth industrial revolution, this technology is crucial. Therefore, I would like to ask, what strategy does the European Union have to follow to achieve its goal of increasing its market share in this sector?
Yes, well, that's exactly one of the sectors where I think the concept of strategic autonomy was perceived as an important one for the reasons you just mentioned. There is, I think, an over-concentration of production capacities in certain types of electronics and chips, particularly in Asia, and this is a combination perhaps of a market-driven logic plus perhaps state intervention. Sometimes subsidies were offered in such sectors by certain countries. So the current situation requires also more direct intervention from European policymakers. We don't have many tools at hand, but I think stimulating, as I said earlier, this smooth transition from fundamental research to economic activities, encouraging young entrepreneurs to be able to market their innovation in this crucial sector, but also probably offering now financial support to promising companies who can scale up production in Europe, not for the sake of bringing necessarily production at home, because I don't think this is a necessary ingredient of strategic autonomy. The main goal, in my view, would be to diversify our ability to supply such ingredients from many sources. So diversification is key, and to diversify, of course, some of these facilities could just as well be in Europe, or for that matter in Spain.
And globally, and in terms of trade agreements, what is the current state of multilateralism?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer in a short time. I would say we've seen much better days for the multilateral trading system than today, and the problems we have now in the functioning of the WTO have been developing over time. This is not a sudden crisis. At the WTO, we had ups and downs, particularly in one of its most important functions, which is international negotiations. So it's been, I think, more than 2 decades since the last successful negotiating round, where countries, WTO members, managed to facilitate trade. That important function of the WTO didn't function well for many, many years. Now we have additional problems with the second pillar of the WTO, which is dispute settlement. So we have rules in place, but if some countries decide not to follow the rules, you cannot take them to court. And that weakens the whole system, the rule of law in general. So this leads to I think a critical moment in the future where the main leaders, the main countries who can take a leadership position in multilateral issues, should step up their efforts to create perhaps a new consensus. There is now, just like strategic autonomy, there is a new concept called responsible consensus, which means that at the WTO, given the fact that consensus is the rule for taking decisions, countries should not use their veto power in an irresponsible manner. I think that's the unofficial definition. So there is a lot of hope that the multilateral trading system will go back to its glory, but I think for the time being we're not yet there.
Yes, and I want to know, in Europe, about 99% of companies are SMEs, and 2 out of 3 private sector shops come from this type of business. However, there is a sense that trade agreements benefit multinationals more than SMEs. So I would like to know, what advantages do SMEs gain from the European Union trades agreement?
I think this is one of the most neglected and powerful messages that we should disseminate as much as possible. It's one of the most unfortunate misconceptions about international trade. That is, that international trade benefits only the happy few, the large companies, the multinational companies. And there are reasons why this has become the acquired wisdom for many people in the street or in the press or elsewhere. It's true that multinational companies are dominant players. They have an important footprint in global supply chains. They generate a lot of the value in trade. But that only tells half of the story. The other half of the story is that the majority of companies who participate in international trade in Europe and elsewhere, the vast majority, as you said, are small and medium enterprises, SMEs. And they are not just small participants. Of course, some of them are small and will remain small, but many of them generate a significant part of their turnover from accessing foreign markets. I'll give you one example, which I think is crucial for the Spanish economy, the agri-food sector. We can think cheese production, beverages, alcoholic beverages, wine, spirits, etc. These are typically sectors dominated by small and medium enterprises. The majority of firms are small and they have their know-how. For these firms, having access to foreign markets is far more important than selling to their domestic customers. And this is them telling us, it's not me saying so. These firms came forward with this very strong message that access to global markets is crucial for their existence. They managed to maintain local employment. They managed to remain connected to their communities. These firms will never delocalize. Someone who produces a type of jamon, I don't know in which part of Spain, will never like to go and delocalize to a different country because this is where their know-how, this is where their roots are. So SMEs are very important for the local communities, and trade is very important for SMEs because those SMEs who become capable of exporting, we have evidence that they increase their productivity, and when they increase their productivity they can expand and they can also pay higher wages. So I think for a young graduate who wants to start a career as an entrepreneur, maybe not the first question, but the second question should be, how do I start exporting? That would be my advice.
Well, that's all for today. Thank you so much, Lucian, for your time and for sharing your ideas with us. It was very interesting to hear your perspective on these issues that impact our lives as European citizens. And to our audience, we wish you an excellent day, afternoon or evening. Thank you all and see you next time.
Thank you and good luck with your podcast series.
Thank you so much.